I started working with black bears about 17 years ago, and I came at it from rather an unusual angle. I graduated from the University of New Hampshire in 1974 with a bachelor's degree in wildlife and had hoped to go on to graduate school to do the kind of work I'm doing today. But unfortunately, I'm dyslexic, and my grade scores and test scores were well below par, and I failed to get into graduate school. As a result, I went out west to a trade school in gunsmithing and have employed myself as a custom gunsmith over the last 30 years. When my wife and I, Debbie, who's at the back of the room there, my wife, and I came back to New Hampshire in 1982, I still had it in my mind that I wanted to do the kind of work that I wanted to do. And I had a leg up on this because my father, Lawrence Killam, who was a virologist at the Dartmouth Medical School, studied birds and wildlife as an avocation. And he wrote the life histories of woodpeckers of the eastern United States, as well as a book on crows and ravens, and published probably 125 journal articles on wildlife and birds in general. So I grew up in a household with lots of wild animals around and had a good sense of what they were and what possibly could be done to study them. My interest was in carnivores, and carnivores presents a problem that was a little different than my dad encountered with birds. My dad prided himself with very simple apparatus, a pair of binoculars and a small folding chair. But carnivores are hard to see. If you go out in the woods, you don't see them very often. You might get a glimpse of them. So I had to come up with some way to have access to these animals. And I had a very simple idea, and that was to get a hold of an orphan animal, to raise it loose in the forest, acting as a surrogate mother to it, and documenting its juvenile behavior, and using that to understand its adult behavior. And I wasn't thinking about black bears at the time. I was thinking about perhaps a coyote or a bobcat or maybe a fisher, the large woodland weasel we have around here. And my sister Phoebe and I became wildlife rehabilitators to legally access one of those animals. But at the end of 2 years of wildlife rehab work, none of those animals had come my way. And one day a conservation officer came to the house with a 11-month-old black bear cub that he thought that had been hit by a car, and he broke departmental policy, but he was unwilling to put the animal down. And we had it checked over by the veterinarians, and we found that it had no broken bones. In fact, it hadn't been hit by a car, and it had no infectious disease. And yet it still was unable to climb and shook violently as it tried to move and fell out of off branches. And we call the first one Wobbly Girl. And that bear, because I didn't have a license and no bears had ever been rehabilitated in New Hampshire prior to that time, the bear was quickly confiscated from me. But later that spring, I got a call from the director of Fish and Game, and he asked me if I'd take that bear back, that nobody was interested in it. And I told him that the only reason I was interested in it was that there was something wrong with it, and it was something that we ought to know something about. And ultimately, the cub had to be euthanized, and we sent the brain out to the wildlife disease lab in Wyoming and got a diagnosis of lysosomal storage disease. And that was the first, which is like Tay-Sachs in humans. It's a congenital disease caused by inbreeding. And it was the first documented case of lysosomal storage disease in black bears. Since then, we've had 2 more cases in New Hampshire. 2 have showed up in Massachusetts. 1 showed up in Maine, and 1 more recently showed up in Wyoming. So I was right in the idea that it's important to find out what's ailing these animals rather than just knocking them in the head and tossing them off into the bushes. But later that spring, I got a call from Vermont Fish and Wildlife, a biologist named Frosty Hammond, and he had 2 cubs orphaned during the Stratton Mountain bear study at Stratton. And he'd heard about what I was interested in doing and asked me if I would take the 2 cubs. And I said, well, there's this issue of a permit. I said, New Hampshire's never had a black bear rehabilitation before, and neither have most of the states. And I said, if you can call New Hampshire Fish and Game and arrange, talk to them about a permit, I'd be happy to take them. The next morning I had a permit in hand, and since that time we have raised and rehabilitated and returned to the wild over 85 black bear cubs. My methods for the work that I do with the bears, my interest is in behavior, and my method is very different from the scientific method. And my method is based on observation, experience, and what I call systematic modeling. I see everything in this world as a system, and if I can identify the system, I can find a solution to it. It's simply a matter of observing enough of the parts and assembling those observations until they make sense. And I find that in a very similar manner to a lawnmower engine, that behavior is made up of component parts, and if you start putting them together, pretty soon they make sense. And I've been at this long enough now that I've assembled a model. You won't be able to read this, but it's fairly comprehensive at this point, and it's reached the level to where I can predict what the social behavior of the black bear is and why each one of these types of behavior are important to them. The black bear has been known to be a solitary animal by the scientific community. I found it to be anything but solitary. They regularly communicate with each other in the wild. A solitary animal typically communicates only with its offspring or its mate during the mating season, and the rest of the time it's by itself. Bears, I found, form coalitions between unrelated animals, reciprocal relationships between adult females, and friendship relationships between males to access food and mates and the like. And that's what I'll be talking about tonight. And the reason for this unusual type of social behavior is the fact that the bear's food supply is unevenly dispersed on the landscape. And the female home ranges, which are as closest to anything that comes to a territory, are evenly dispersed on the landscape. So at any given time, one female can have absolutely no food in her home range, and her neighbor can have a huge surplus. And this leads to the conditions of sharing and cooperative behavior between unrelated animals. The only other animal that's been identified with this type of behavior are humans. The study with the great apes and chimpanzees and orangutans and all these types of animals, all these animals are traditionally social animals, which there's a territory, and a family group lives within a territory, and then there's a hard hierarchy within that territory that establishes access to food, mates, and other resources. As I said, we've raised and released over 85 cubs, but the cubs I'll be talking about tonight are the cubs that came to me when they were very young, before they had any experience with their mothers outside their natural dens. These cubs came to me from the age 7 weeks to about 12 weeks old. I walked them loose in the forest for up to 9 hours at a time and returned them to remote cages that we use to keep control of them and keep them safe during the night. These cubs allowed me to observe their very first response to their natural environment. I watched their tongues coming out as it stuck to scent on a sapling, and pull that scent back in with their tongue and offer it to the papilla of the vomeronasal organ. And that's a little bump behind their incisors, in which they identify scent with. Bears and other animals with this type of olfaction system have two olfactory systems. One's the vomeronasal system, and the other is the normal epithelial system that we have. Dogs have this type of system, and you can feel this papilla by going home tonight to your dog and putting your finger up behind his incisors, and you'll feel that bump. And when your dog comes up and kisses you and gives you a lick on the hand, he's not always kissing you. He's sometimes making sure that's you that's standing there. And so I was able to see this very exaggerated motion as these cubs lifted scent in this manner, and many other types of olfaction, which other scientists had said were unobservable. As adult animals, you can barely see the tongue come out. It still comes out, but it comes out so rapidly that it's almost unobservable. And so I was able to lock down all these behaviors at this early time. I was able to follow some of these bears into adulthood. This is a bear named Yoda. I lost her a couple of years ago. I could literally hold a video camera between her front paws and film her tongue coming out, licking up ants after she bit into a log or a stump. She lived till she was 5.5 and raised one set of cubs. The main bear that I work with is a bear named Squirty. Squirty has been featured in my book Among the Bears and all the documentaries that I've done. Squirty is now about 15 years old and will have her 8th set of cubs this winter. Squirty has been successful in establishing her own home range and expanding her home range to share it with several of her daughters and granddaughters. She has developed what I call a matrilinear hierarchy, and in this hierarchy, here I'll get strangled. In this hierarchy, Squirty's the matriarch, and on site she chases her daughter SQ2, her granddaughter SNLO, her youngest daughter Brooke, another granddaughter 2, and the youngest of the bunch SQ2LO, who's the daughter of SQ2. And it's linear because on site SQ2 chases everybody below her, and SNLO chases everybody below her, and everybody chases SQ2LO. And the result of this type of hierarchy is that Squirty doesn't share her greater home range with daughters or granddaughters unless they obey her rules. And she's the one who went out there and carved out this extra space, and every time she created some new territory, she dropped a daughter in to hold that ground. And so in a marginal food year, Squirty, because she's the top of the hierarchy, is guaranteed, or her chances are increased of being able to produce cubs. And the other ones, as they go down the hierarchy, are less and less able to produce in a marginal food year. In a year when there's an abundance of food, there's a good chance that all the females will produce. So this is a natural mechanism that allows bears to manage their own populations relative to the natural food supplies that are out there. The second benefit that Squirty gets out of this is that when she was establishing her greater home ranges and fighting with neighbors to take new ground, in the height of the berry season, when she should have been putting on weight, she was actually at her lowest weight of the season. And now that she's surrounded by daughters and granddaughters, she's able to carry weight from one year to the next because she doesn't have to use that energy expenditure for going out there and having contests with the neighboring females. And that also increases her chances of reproducing. The young males that come into the female home ranges are quickly asked to leave. The sons of the litters are also chased out. This sequence is Squirty chasing her grandson. These are often vigorous chases. When it's family members, it takes them sometimes quite a long time to get the message. I watched about 30 chases of both Squirty and SQ2 chasing the grandson before he finally left into the upper valley population of bears in September. The unrelated male bears that come into these female home ranges are unceremoniously chased off, and they leave very quickly because they don't have any family relationship and can't just pass it off as oh, that's just mom. The large males that come into these home ranges during the breeding season, which they do every 2 years, often stay around to try to feed on surplus resources, but they're also quickly told to leave. And in this sequence, Squirty, who weighs at the time about 175 or 180 pounds, is chasing off a 250-pound male. And the next day he left. I watched SQ2 when she weighed 135 pounds do a stiff-legged walk in front of a 350-pound male, and she went zigzagging back and forth in front of him, and he backed off into the bushes acting like it wasn't any big deal. But in the morning, he was gone as well. And this type of behavior by the males, the fact that they can take food from whoever they want to because of their size, reflects that there's a degree of female choice in mating. And otherwise, they would stay and compete with the females and their cubs in these female home ranges. The unexpected thing that I discovered about bears was there was a number of females coming in to the place where I meet Squirty to do my observations, and it's on a piece of property that I own. And I go up in the evening and I offer a small food reward for any bear that shows up. And sometimes no bears show up, and sometimes a lot of bears show up. And it is largely females that show up, and mostly family members, but there's a component of unrelated females that show up. And they happen to be all belonging to the clan of this bear, who we call Moose, probably not a good name. But Moose is the matriarch of the neighboring clan to the east. And she and her daughters and granddaughters have free access to Squirty's innermost circle. And Squirty shows, and her offspring show no aggression towards these unrelated females whatsoever. And this is an indication of reciprocal contracts and cost counting. It happens to be that in my study area, the property that's owned by Squirty and her clan is an oak ridge, and Moose is a bear that lives to the east, and in the area to the east, it's all beach. So in any given year, Squirty can have a huge surplus of acorns, and Moose and her clan can have nothing. And this sets up the sequence for reciprocal sharing. The fact that there's no aggression shown towards these unrelated females is very similar to human behavior. We're harshest on our family members, but we certainly don't go out and accost strangers and treat them the way we would treat a family member. And the reason is that we may need that stranger at a later time. And we can reconcile with family members, but we might not be able to reconcile with a stranger. And this is an indication of a greater society and greater levels of sharing taking place for access for food. I didn't really understand social contracts in bears for quite a few years, even though I wrote about them in Among the Bears. Sometimes it takes me a long time after seeing behavior to really understand what that behavior is and to be able to put a word to it. But a few years ago, I set up an experiment that was duplicating an experiment done by Wolfgang Kohler back in the late 40s or early 50s. And he withheld food from chimpanzees and scattered a bunch of boxes around to see if the chimpanzees had the insight to move the boxes and stack them up to get the food. And it took the chimpanzees about 3 years to accomplish this task, but they did accomplish it. And it was an indication of the early understanding of possible tool use in chimpanzees. Animals typically use their environment. They don't think about ways to improve their environment unless they're absolutely necessary for them to do that. I didn't expect great things to happen quickly because it took the chimpanzees so long to accomplish this, but I knew that black bears were very insightful. I knew from my experience with nuisance bears around the state and across the country and into Canada that any situation that you set up where you put food out and expected a black bear not to get into it, they were going to get into it. If you want a bear on your roof, all you've got to do is put a bird feeder on your roof and you'll have a bear on your roof. And so the first bear that came into this setup, I had a remote camera filming it, was Squirty's oldest daughter at the time, Snowy, and she came in and she stood on her hind legs, and she flexed her knees, and she judged that she couldn't reach the bag. And she quickly climbed the oak tree in the 2 minutes the camera was on, and she grabbed the rope and she snapped it twice with her teeth. The bag broke loose and she got the corn. The next bear that came in was her daughter at the time, SNLO, who was an 80-pound juvenile. And she came in and stood on the box and leapt for the bag and missed it. And within the 2 minutes the camera was on, she quickly climbed the oak tree, went arm over arm down the rope, grabbed the bag of corn, and dropped off the rope and got the bag of corn. Well, Squirty, this is Squirty in the picture. I was there when Squirty came in, and I got to remind you that my relationship with Squirty is very different from any of the other bears that I'm currently working with. But all of the bears raised as a surrogate mother to. Because I raised them as a surrogate mother, they have access to me that none of the other bears have. They're not intimidated by my presence at all. So if I do something wrong, Squirty corrects my behavior. And that's generally done with a bite. And so when Squirty came in, she came in and stood up and checked out that the bag of food was unreachable. And then she went to the box and bit big splinters out of the box and rolled it in the wrong direction. And then she went over to my remote camera and started messing with my remote camera. She came back, and this is all within about 2 minutes' time. She came back to my pickup truck, put both paws over the mirror, started rocking the truck, and looked up at me as though she could rip the mirror off the truck. I knew she could because she'd done it on a previous occasion. She then, when I hollered, exclaimed no, and she responded and went back to the remote video camera and messed with that. Then she came back to me, she did a symbolic bite at my knee, and then she bit me on the knee, and I produced a bag of corn. But I knew at that moment that Squirty and I had a social contract, that I had expectations of her behavior and she had expectations of my behavior. And I expected her to wear a radio collar. I expected to be able to take it on and off of her without sedating her. I expected to interrupt her natural behavior and take her time, so to speak. And she expected the damn food be put on the ground. I went home that evening and showed my video to my wife, Debbie, and I happened to say, well, you know, this is a lot like our behavior. Our relationship. And she said, what do you mean? And I said, well, when you think about it, you know, when two humans get together in marriage or in any other kind of friendship or relationship, they really don't know anything about the person that they marry. They get this flood of oxytocin in their head, and they fall crazy in love, and next thing you know, they're married to a perfect stranger. And then they have to start negotiating how to cooperate with the most important cooperator in their life. And they both know that they can't trust words, because with words people can lie. You can falsify information, and so each person has an expectation of the other person's behavior. And that those expectations, the performance is judged by actions, not by words. So when one person's actions exceed the other person's expectation, there's this big emotional blast that corrects the situation. The scientific term is moralistic aggression. And that can happen, and it's very harsh. That can happen because the partners can reconcile. And this is exactly the same thing that takes place with Squirty. When she got done biting me on the knee, she went into the soft, repetitive moan of reconciliation, saying, I'm terribly sorry, but that was necessary. And that has happened every time we've had this kind of conflict. Unfortunately, they hurt. Now, I wondered what the male bears did that was different. The females are relatively easy to study because you put tracking collars on a female and they stay in a defined home range. You always can find your females. You put a tracking collar on a male bear and he could be anywhere in the state of New Hampshire the next day. They go over mountain ranges. They can travel 100 miles. You never know where they're going to end up. And so I started about 15 years ago as the remote trail cameras started to become available, I started trying to film the other bears that were inside the female home ranges. So I wouldn't be thinking that there were only females in those home ranges. And I've taken literally between 40 and 60,000 pictures. But in 2008, in a overgrown clear cut in lime that was probably 15 or 17 years old, but just about past its productivity, I was able to film 8 to 10 different males. And the method that I use with these cameras is to put a small bag of corn, the amount that one bear can easily eat in front of the camera. And generally within 2 weeks' time, I can film all the bears that are in that area. And this clear-cut area was about maybe 200 acres or 250 acres. And so there was a very high density of male bears utilizing this area. In these cutover areas, there's increases of berries, beaked hazelnuts, and ants, bees, and grubs. And they are important areas for black bears. The interesting thing was that in 2009, all these bears were gone, and the only bear left was the resident female. I didn't film a single male bear in that habitat the next year or subsequent years after that. And the other thing that I realized was that I had an awful lot of pictures of 2 male bears in front of the camera at the same time sharing that small amount of food. And this is when it clicked on me that these bears had developed coalitions or friendships that allowed them to access surplus foods in female home ranges, that if they came in by themselves, as I'd seen with Squirty and her relatives many, many times, they were quickly asked to go to the door and stay out. And yet if they came in to a surplus, when there's a surplus foods in the area, in a female home range, and they came in as a coalition of 8 or 10 young males that were buddies with each other, they could overpower the females, and then there would be more of them than the females could chase out. And this is a sign of very early group formation, and it's group formation between unrelated males. We did DNA studies and found that the general male population was unrelated. I work with the UNH Genome Center with hair samples. And so again, we have the kind of social behavior that is seen in humans where group formation takes place between unrelated individuals. This is very similar in some ways to the work that Bernd Heinrich did with ravens. He wondered why when an immature raven or an unmated raven found a source of food, he would broadcast and call out to whatever other raven could hear to try to get other ravens to come and share the food with him. And he found out that if that bird that found the food went down to get the food and the territorial pair noticed them, he'd be driven right out of the county and wouldn't get a meal at all. But if he broadcast and attracted his buddies in, and 15 to 17 ravens showed up, they'd all go down and get a meal. The territorial pair would come in and would be unable to chase them out. The difference is that the ravens just broadcast to whoever will hear, and the bears make personal relationships between individuals. All of this, again, is about access to food, and in the spring of the year, there is an abundance of food for the bears, and in the spring of the year, the food is what I call emerging growth. It's universally available. It's uniformly distributed across the landscape, and because of this, the bears pick the spring of the year for their mating season. And the female bears come into estrus from the last week of May until the first week of July, when the berries first start to form, and they're now available in patches and nuts and stands and things like that are unevenly dispersed. The male and the female bear will spend 3 to 7 days together, and the result of that union is a 2-celled organism called a blastocyst. They're delayed implanters, so that blastocyst won't implant into the uterus until late November, early December. And then there's a short gestation period of about 50 to 55 days, and the cubs are born in the middle of January. They're born weighing less than a pound. Their little eyes are shut, their ear flaps are down. They continue to develop outside the womb in their mother's fur, and they're not even able to follow her until she emerges from the den in April. They'll stay with their mother. The first thing they'll do when they come out from the den is she'll make a bed at the bottom of a good climbing tree and coach her cubs the very first time they go up the tree, so they can learn about dead bark and smooth bark and the skinny end of a limb. Bears, before they can travel with their mother through the summer, have to be able to climb. She'll take them as they learn to climb from babysitting tree to babysitting tree, and these will be their safety trees. And she'll radiate out from the bottom to feed and keep close contact of the cubs while they're up the trees. The cubs will sleep in the trees, play in the trees, and they'll follow her throughout the summer, and by fall, they're very much able to travel and travel long distances if they need to, depending on the food supply. They'll den with her that winter, and the family breakup will take place when the male shows up the following June. This year I was fortunate to watch mating taking place between two black bears. I watched the courtship behavior as well as the mating behavior. It looks very aggressive. The smaller bear is the female, and the male is the larger bear. The male checked on the condition of estrus of the females by checking wherever they laid down, and he used his tongue to sample the scent to find out if they're going to be receptive or not. These are bears that don't see each other all year long, so when they first come together, there's quite a lot of aggression that takes place between them. But the females are spontaneous ovulators, and it takes this kind of excitement to make them ovulate exactly when the male is there. And so it's a very precise form of mating. She looks like she's going to chew his head off, but he's kind of not paying any attention to it. When he came and proposed to her, he made the softest little chirp, a series of chirps as he approached her, a very seductive approach. They continued for about 45 minutes going around the clearing. She'd often have her head held down going, oh, which is a negative sign that bears make. Again, you could see they were getting more and more excited by the whole interaction between the two of them. You can see the difference in size between the male and the female. That's sexual dimorphism. The larger males indicates that they're competing to mate. Only the largest 10% of the males do all the mating. I used to think because of the 3 to 7 days that one male could mate with maybe 3 females during the mating season. Well, this guy proved to be the bear on steroids. From June 16th till the first week of July, he was with 5 different females that I know about. And I don't know what he did before I saw him the first time. Again, more of this open mouth display. And then finally, he's able to grasp her, and he bites her behind the neck, again stimulating ovulation. The first time that they coupled up was only for a few minutes, and then they disappeared into the bush for about 20 minutes. They came back into the clearing, and they coupled up again. And then this time they were hooked up for 45 minutes. They're like dogs. They have a baculum that locks over the pelvis. And while they were coupled up, there was a lot of rubbernecking going on by the other bears in the clearing. It soon became dark, and I assume this process repeated itself. 85% of the black bear's diet is vegetative. The balance of the 10 to 15% is animal protein, and of that animal protein, 90 to 95% is ants, bees, and grubs. A very small proportion is they will take deer fawns and moose calves if they have the opportunity. They are opportunists. They'll take birds' nests and fledgling birds off a stick, off a branch if they come across them. They're not true predators. They have molars like ours. They're meant for chewing their food. They're not like carnivores with slicing teeth. They don't easily break into a carcass. And they will also take domestic animals on occasion, largely because domestic animals are slow, and almost always ungulates. Here's Yoda eating a blackberry. Bears eat their food one piece at a time. When I would go in on the radio signal to see both Yoda and Squirty on one stage of my work, I'd take them a small food reward of dog food. It would take them 35 minutes to eat that small bag of dog food. If I offered that same amount of food to my Labrador buddy, he would inhale it in about a minute and a half. The summer vegetative foods, the important ones to the black bear, all grow in wetland soils, moist and rich soils around wetlands, rivers and streams, and the base of hills where you might find white ash and soft maple growing. There are three primary species, jewelweed or touch-me-not that grows in everybody's yard, three species of wild lettuce, again a succulent, and the most important is jack-in-the-pulpit. And jack-in-the-pulpit is the most important because it has a root or a corm that's more nutritious than either beech nuts or acorns, and they eat it from the size of a dime to the size of a baseball. It's the summer habitat of the black bear that brings humans and bears as close together as they come. It's not unusual for somebody to have a nice mowed lawn leading up to an orchard behind their house, and with maybe 3 feet of cover of interrupted fern. And they'd never know there was a black bear out there feeding on jack-in-the-pulpit unless they went out there and looked for those stompled trails and the occasional divot with the white roots growing into it where the black bear dug the jack-in-the-pulpit. They'd never know that the black bear was out there unless that bear stuck its nose up in the air and smelled black oil sunflower seed. Black oil sunflower seed has twice the calories per unit of any of their natural foods, and in the springtime it's about 6 times the calories per unit. Bears prioritize their food by the quality of food, the quantity of food, and the amount of risk that it takes to get the food. Black oil sunflower seed is served up in quantities, in my experience, between 5 and 35 pounds at a time. So it's not unusual for a black bear to come into somebody's yard and get a day's pay in about 15 minutes. If you want to understand why the bear eats the way he does and why he's driven for food the way he is, all you have to do is think about the way we behave around money. Both humans and bears store resources for later times of need. The black bear, the average black bear, to hibernate and get through the winter needs to put on 30% of its body weight in fat just to survive the winter. A female that's bred and that's going to have cubs needs to put on 50% of her body weight in fat to get through the winter and to nurse her cubs and to have some reserves for the spring. We put our money in the bank. We have it there for our retirement, to put our kids through school, to buy the boat we always wanted to buy. And if you want to see us behave in really strange ways, all you have to do is get money involved. I recently, a couple of years ago, I did a film, A Man Among Bears, with National Geographic up in the White Mountains, and we worked at a dumpster. And they salted the dumpster with some donuts, and this young bear was going into the dumpster after the donuts, and I was walking him out. And I suggested to the producer that we get $101 bills, and we spread a little trail up to the dumpster and mix them up with all that slop in there and put up a couple remote video cameras and go to lunch and see what we got dumpster diving. But they didn't have a very good sense of humor. The fall foods that are important for the black bear to put on weight and to get through the winter in New Hampshire are beech nuts and red oak acorns. The red oak is primarily in the central and southern part of the state and stretching up the Connecticut River Valley. and beach is primarily in the eastern and northern parts of the state. I know people are interested in bear dens. I'm crawling out of an excavated den that was dug by Yoda as a maternal den, and she used it as a den for her yearlings as well. It was in a root mass of a tree that was probably blown over in the '38 hurricane. Bears need exposed soil to dig in. They don't dig through live roots or rocks very well. And when I crawled into this den and looked up, the ceiling of the den was a matrix of live roots of that tree that was growing out of the hummock. And that prevented the soil from collapsing down around the sow and her cubs during the wintertime. They also are generally on a hummock or at the top of a rise and in well-drained soils. There's several different types of den in New Hampshire. This bear chose a completely different strategy. She's on a hummock in a hardwood clear-cut. This is what we call an open ground nest. She's nestled up next to a log, which is fairly typical, and she lined the den, which was just a little divot in the ground with the rotted wood off the log. This typically would be in dense softwood regeneration and in conditions where you could walk by the bear and never even see it. This is a very unusual one, being out in the open like this. But she opted for the winter sun to take care of her cub and keep her warm during the winter. The other type of dens that we have in New Hampshire are rock dens, and these dens are in the pile of rocks at the bottom of ledges. They're not true caves or anything like that. These dens make our winter den work very difficult because the bear can get into an opening that's not much larger than its head. Bears' shoulders are very supple. They drop down to their side. Their backs are very flexible. They can wiggle into almost any kind of hole. Often we end up in conditions where we can't even reach the bear, let alone if we sedated it, we couldn't get it out. We're all broad-shouldered and stiff-backed, and it makes life a little interesting. The last type of den we find in New Hampshire is a tree den, and these are in the large overgrown trees. Bears, I think, would use these almost exclusively if there were more large overgrown trees, but New Hampshire's had a logging economy for the last 200 years, and the only large overgrown trees we find are on boundary lines and in boulder fields where the logging crews couldn't get to them. This tree was in lime outside of a new residential area, and I got a call one day in April that this woman had a bear in her tree, and I got there, and sure enough, there was a bear in her tree. And I let her know that the bear had been in her tree all winter long. The first set of cubs that we raised, the den boxes were a little too close to the sugar house, and we made a little too much noise. And like most New Hampshire boys and girls, when they got up, they wanted to go snowmobiling. I really didn't mind them running the snowmobile all over the property, but every time I went to use it, it was out of gas. A couple helpers in our maple sugar operation. And Debbie's often commented that every time we think we've seen everything we can see about bears, a surprise takes place. And the surprise took place last year. Last year, Squirty came down off not last winter, but the winter before. Squirty came down off the mountain with a single male cub. And her daughter, SQ2, had triplets. And in May, I got a call from somebody living in SQ2's home range that he'd seen her feeding on acorns, and he said 2 of the cubs are very vigorous and playing, and the other cub is lethargic and hanging around up in a tree and not mixing with the other 2. And I explained to him that you know, we've been tracking bears for a long time now, and it's not unusual for a bear to give birth to 2 and raise 1, or give birth to 3 and raise 2. That each female produces the same amount of milk, and so if 2 of the cubs or 1 of the cubs is more aggressive about getting the milk, it gets large and the other ones get small. And so I said, if we had a spell of rain, that cub could get hypothermic, and then you just see two. Well, so it happened. It was the middle of May. About a week later, SQ2 showed up at the clearing just before dark. I hadn't seen her there that year. She was wearing a GPS collar, and so was Squirty. And she hadn't been there but prior to that time. She was very emotional. I wished I could take a picture, but there wasn't enough light, and there wasn't much I could do. She tried to lead me off into the woods like she was trying to communicate with me in some fashion, and I had to go on my way. The next day, I got a call from the neighbor that they'd said they'd seen SQ2 in their field, and that morning, but now it was evening, and there was a cub bawling incessantly at the top of a large pine tree and had been doing so for about 2 hours. And I said, the bears know how many cubs they have. I said, she'll be back if she's missing a cub. And I didn't go up to the clearing that evening because I had a lecture to give, and so I went up the next night, and I got to the clearing, and I saw a cub above Squirty, and I thought everything was normal. And a male bear entered the clearing, and as they create quite a stir, and the two cubs ran up the tree above Squirty, and then I thought it wasn't Squirty, and it turns out that in that one evening, Squirty and her daughter SQ2 had negotiated an adoption, and that adoption lasted for the rest of the cub rearing period. The SQ2 would routinely come to the clearing, her two male cubs with her, and Squirty with the daughter Josie. It was on several occasions I saw all the cubs up the same tree. Josie would come down and run to her grandmother, Squirty, and the two males would come down and run to their natural mother. And so I don't know, as I say, what was communicated or how they communicated it, but there was definitely a contract drawn up in one night, and a fairly complex one at that. Adoptions are not common in wild animals. They're known to exist in chimpanzees, elephants, and in humans. This type of play, which increases as the cubs get older, is often described by biologists as mock fighting. It starts on the ground with open mouth wrestling and quickly accelerates into a bipedal stance where they have these aggressive looks on their face and they push each other back and forth. It's done in dead silence. I found it to be anything but aggressive. It's actually a very ritualized type of play that allows the bears to solicit food sharing or friendship from other bears. I have some remote video that I've taken where a large male bear comes into one of my monitoring cameras. It was a video camera, and lays down to eat that small pile of corn, and while he's eating, a second large male comes in and skirts around him, honoring his position, comes back towards him, opens his mouth. They do the open mouth wrestle. They stand up and wrestle, and then they lay down and share that small amount of corn. With this complex type of social behavior, you would expect there to be a complex communication as well. And it turns out the bears are probably one of the most advanced communicators. They communicate both with olfaction and with vocalizations and body language. I discovered an organ in the bear's nose that I believe to be an accessory organ to the vomeronasal system that specializes in identifying aromatic compounds used in food identification and long-range scent identification. The bears, as near as I can tell, are the only animals that communicate long distances with scent. Bears, the animals that don't have this organ, and I've been to the museums checking out other skulls, all have long-range vocalization. So the chimpanzees pant hoot, the wolves howl, and so forth. The bears, when they're receiving scent, will open and close their mouth and hold their head up like this. And what's different about them and dogs is that bears will act emotionally to the scent that they receive. So if Squirty gets some scent in the air of her mate and he's 10 minutes out, she'll get this very pleasant look on her face. And if there's a bear 10 minutes out that she really doesn't like and doesn't want anywhere near around her, she'll start false charging and swatting the ground and huffing and snorting and carrying on. So it's a very different type of communication. They also have emotional expression, and the expressions are honest communication. We have an emotional communication as humans. It's probably the most complex of any animal in the world. We couldn't meet in this room if we weren't all satisfied and comfortable with the emotional state of everybody else in this room, and that's written all over our face. Everybody has a neutral face right now. That's what I call subway face. It's the face that you encounter wherever you go in the world if you get on a subway. If you go to a presidential rally and you see the Secret Service guy looking over the crowd, he's looking for the one face that doesn't look like any other face in the crowd. He's not looking for a gun, because if a gun showed up, the president would be dead. He's reading faces. And faces is the most common way we communicate all day long, but we're largely do it subconsciously. We're not aware of what's taking place. We have a feeling about what's taking place. So the bears have this type of honest communication. They have expression of their ears. They have expression of their face. They have eyebrow expression, eye expression, and facial expression. Here's Squirty just after she's put one of her cubs after family breakup up a tree. She's a little bit aggravated. And here she is with a happy face. And there's quite a variety of faces that take place in between. Bears also have an expression of intention, and this is where they vary quite largely from most other species. Most other species are known to cry out with emotion, and others receive the sound, but there's no direct communication between two individuals. Bears have an expression of intention, and with this, they're deliberately making sounds and actions that have meaning based on the context of the situation. These are mechanically generated sounds and actions, so now they chomp their teeth, they huff, they swat, and they false charge. The meaning of a false charge is, again, based on context. So if you're walking down a trail one day and you encounter a female bear and her cubs are already up in a tree, and she false charges you, she simply wants to delay confrontation long enough so you can communicate with her. Bears, because they routinely communicate with strangers, negotiate outcomes of situations. So if you were working at a restaurant and you're carrying a pail of food scraps out to the dumpster and a bear false charges you, he simply wants you to drop the pail of food scraps before you put it in the dumpster so he can get a meal. I was with Squirty one afternoon up on Lambert Ridge. It was a nice sunny day, and this thunderstorm came rumbling up the valley. Squirty false charged the thunderstorm. And believe it or not, it turned and the sun came back out. So essentially, the expression of intention is mixed with emotion, and it forms what I believe to be a proto-language. If you think about our language, it's an emotional utterance, the emotional inflection we put on our words, and then that has the mechanical manipulation of our lips, teeth, and tongue, which allows us to lie, and the emotion delivers the truth at the same time. So we have a very complex form of communication. Here's Squirty lifting scent off an object. She expels moist air out of her lungs and then draws it back up through the olfaction system to identify it. Oops. Bears are able to follow each other to find food, but they have transparency. Wherever they travel, they're leaving scent that they have no control over, and they're able to follow each other to punish. And when I say punish, because these bears routinely cooperate and are altruistic towards other individuals, they, like humans, they have to have a mechanism to punish cheaters. And bears punish. And that's... and this was evident in raising the cubs. It's very similar to human children and very different from young dogs. The human child uses pain and pleasure to manipulate its parents to make sure its parents do a proper job in raising it. It'll use a smile and crying early on, and then later on verbal assaults and good behavior. And finally they grow out of all that and leave the nest. But bears bite, and bears bite commensurate with a crime. And so they have a whole routine of punishment that ranges from a very small grab of the mouth to an ultimate death sentence. Bears have deliberate marking. The further bear, you might argue, is not marking at all, but as she ducks under that sapling, she's depositing the sebaceous oils off her back, which are large molecules, long-lasting marks that are done intentionally. The bear in the foreground is the same sapling, different bear, and now she's holding the sapling over her head and making sure she gets all of that sebaceous oil she can on that sapling. The most common way bears get together during the breeding season in New Hampshire is at these red pine breeding trees. The male bears, the dominant male bears, will have the best array of trees. He'll back rub and deposit his scent on the trees, and then he'll rotate his head and bite the tree. And when he bites the tree, he's releasing the aromatic chemicals from the sap of the tree to advertise his mark. His scent, the large molecules he's depositing on the tree have low volatility and very little scent. So the bears were the first advertisers as well. When the female bear goes out looking for the fellow that she's selected, she'll find his scent and she'll mark on the tree and wait nearby. He'll come pick her up and they'll get out of dodge. And the reason they get out of dodge is that the female, when she comes into estrus, is advertising her condition of estrus and ovulating over the airwaves. Wherever that male goes, there will be an entourage of younger males that will follow them. And wherever the male travels with the female as they're traveling together, he'll set up a 2-acre territory around her wherever she happens to be. And he'll back rub many different trees. If she comes into your yard during the mating season with a big male, you might see this type of behavior in your backyard. Here's the male back rubbing, biting the tree, and then finally looking pretty proud of himself. Now for this talk, I've started this summer, we've started getting some really good data off some GPS collars that we have. We now have satellite transmissions that come to us every 2 days. So we know where the bears are and what they're feeding on and what's taking place. And this picture depicts 7 different females over the landscape in my study area. And those are 3-day movements by each of the females. And those females stayed in those general areas throughout the spring and summer. To give you some sense of how the female home ranges go across the landscape. Now we know from the work we did this summer that there's missing females, and we have pictures of the missing females that fill in that landscape. Here's early movements of one of the bears that was up behind my place. She denned right on the ledges on Holt's Ledge. You can see the very first tree she went to was babysitting trees, teaching her cubs to climb. She stayed there for almost 3 weeks before they were able to begin to follow her. Again, each one of these spots is a babysitting tree and her movements radiating out of it. And finally, by the first part of May, the cubs are able to travel longer distances with her. She's still going to babysitting trees and spending considerable amounts of time before finally getting down to a food-rich area where she spent the first couple of months. This is the same female in the summertime. Now, this is in July when the raspberries are ripe. She only has logging cuts in her home range. The logging that took place up here is probably 10 years old. It doesn't have many raspberries left. It's more of a blackberry lot now. This was from the blowdowns in April of 2006, and it was the first year of a big raspberry crop, and you can see the importance of that raspberry crop by the concentration of the amount of time she spent in there. And this is another female. This female has a large component of wetlands in her home range. It's the wetland shrubs, and there's a wide variety of wetland shrubs from mountain holly and winterberry and nannyberry and all those different types of shrubs that provide food from the wetlands. She spent most of the summer working those wetlands and the few logging areas that she had inside her home range. And this is the kind of thing that I'm very interested in. This is just a week or so ago, and this bear, who was over near the Goose Pond Road in Lyme, suddenly made a long migration up to Smarts Mountain to check out the beech crop. And there's an abundance crop of beech this year. She did the same thing 3 years ago when there was a beech crop. And now we've got 3 different bears, Squirty, SN2, and Cora, all overlapping home ranges. And this is the kind of social behavior that they need, all this complex ability to communicate in order to share foods under these kind of conditions. So, to end up tonight, I have a quick visual I call Houdini's Apple Tree Olympics. It's visual, so hang on. And finally is dismount. Thank you very much. Okay, the first question is, do the same males stay in the same area from year to year? What I found is Squirty is mated with 8 different males. And I see that the whole male population from the camera pictures I've taken over the years is relatively transient. They may be in the area for a couple of years. Some individuals may be in the area for a couple of years, but generally the whole population is moving and changing over time. The wetland components are very important for black bears, but it's not only the big, well-established wetlands with the shrubs, it's every little small pocket of wetland that grows jack-in-the-pulpit and other vegetative foods in the forest. And they're without question, the fact that we log our forests is important to the black bear. It creates that early successional habitat that creates berries and insects, which are important to the females. So the female bears need not only the berry component of wetlands or logging cuts, they also need the upland component of oaks and beech and things like that. But in the fall, and that's usually when the big movement takes place, the big change, bears will travel to where the food is, because that fall nut component can be greatly varied. In some years, 2003, 2004, we had a complete nut failure. And suddenly the bear population in New Hampshire tripled. And it's because bears leave the deep forest and end up in our backyards in those periods. And we think the population has just suddenly skyrocketed. It hasn't. Those are deep woods bears that are coming out to get food. The question was, why are bears climbing beech trees instead of going to the apple trees, which are abundant this year in people's backyards, or the cornfields down by the river? And that comes down to what I talked about before. They prioritize their foods by quality, quantity, and risk. And risk is a huge factor. When there's natural foods available in the forest, the bears are going to stay in the forest. When there's no natural foods in their secure habitats, they're going to take the risk and go out and expose themselves. They're very, very conscious of exposing themselves. Yes?
You mentioned population. What would you say the history of black bear population is in the last 100 years and where it is today regarding population?
The question is about population. I would assume in Vermont and New Hampshire in the years and where it is today. In Vermont and New Hampshire, there was a bounty on black bears for 125 years. It ended in the 1950s. The black bear population was probably reduced in New Hampshire to about 80 individuals. It was not just the hunting or the bounty that did it. In the 1850s, 85% of New Hampshire was open agricultural land. There was no habitat. It's been the reforestation of New Hampshire and Vermont that has allowed the black bear to recover, and the fact that there's been a hunting season put on the bear and limits put on their take. So now the black bear's population has recovered nicely. There's an estimated 6,000 black bears in Vermont and about 4,800 black bears in New Hampshire. Yes?
The bears that you have a personal relationship with seem to be attuned to humans. And how vulnerable does that make them when they are out wandering?
Well, it's not a great deal of a factor. The reality is that almost every bear in New Hampshire is attuned to humans. I don't believe there's a black bear in New Hampshire or Vermont that hasn't taken somebody's bird feeder at some place in time. And because they're a food-sharing animal, they, like us, think highly of those that they get food from. And bears get tamer quicker than any other animal out there. I have been credited with the ownership of almost every black bear in the state of New Hampshire when people see tame behavior. But the reality is all you have to do is leave your feeder out there and then put it out there the next day and you've got a tame black bear. And a tame black bear is what's considered a nuisance bear, and ultimately, because of human behavior, the bear suffers in those kind of conditions. Yes?
What should one do if you're on the trail and encounter a bear doing a false charge or a charge, whichever?
What should you do if you encounter a bear on a trail? The most common bear that you would encounter and to where you'd have to understand the situation would be a sow and cubs. The bear, typically, if they have a critical distance at which they won't flee, and a sow with cubs that are already up a tree is not going to flee. Typically, she'll false charge and then she'll circle you. She's circling simply to find out who you are. She wants to smell your back trail. The false charging can be very exciting if you've never experienced it before. She's not going to charge you. Bears that display, that chomp their teeth and false charge and swat the ground are all trying to negotiate a settlement to the situation. A recent paper came out talking about human deaths by black bears, and they found that the predatory behavior of the black bear was not from females and cubs, which everybody thought were the most dangerous. It was from mature male black bears. 85% of human deaths were caused by mature male black bears. Having said that, only a half a person a year over the last 100 years have been killed by a black bear. So it's our least common form of death. But going back to the question, my advice is to simply hold your ground, keep your eyes on the bear, again with a neutral face, and talk softly to it. And what you're doing is you're staying dominant, your eyes are your strength. If you show weakness, any animal that's under stress will want to dominate its fear. And so it doesn't matter if it's a dog you encounter, another human, or a bear. That same basic premise holds true. There's a lot of commonality in behavior between all species. And so you want to talk softly to it because bears understand the soft tone means appeasement. Bears are the only animal, in my experience, that are able to read human emotional communication better than we understand it ourselves and act accordingly. I've been in close contact with more than 30 sows and their cubs, some that I know, some that I don't know. And at the end of 10 or 15 minutes of maybe false charging, chomping, and circling, when I control my own behavior, they could care less about me. They leave me with the cubs, they go off and feed, they have no greater concern. They've read who I am and what kind of a person I've projected. And so basically you're telling them you're strong, but you're not a threat. And in my experience, that's a far better way to deal with these bears than going out there being fearful and being loaded for bears, so to speak. Yes?
What is it that you say quietly to the bear?
Well, one of the wardens in Vermont said it was my Father who art in heaven. Yes?
Yeah, we have a long driveway lined with these little cherry trees, and some are fairly high, some are small. About the first week of August, those trees get a real hit with the bears, and the big bear will just crash that tree right down. Any way to protect these? We lost almost all the trees.
Well, it's easy. Just pick all the fruit. But the reality is that, you know, we tend to plant fruit-bearing shrubs in our yards and in places like that, and they're bear fruit. And bears are nature's pruners. When they go up in a beech tree to feed in the top of a beech tree, they're breaking branches in and building with those so-called nests. When they feed in a cherry tree, they're breaking branches in. All those resprout and grow more nuts within a couple of years the next fruit cycle. So even though they don't prune exactly the way we like them to, generally a good, healthy, mature tree will survive. But more than likely a young tree, you know, won't. But again, you'd have the same problem with deer if you planted apple trees and you were living next to a deer yard. So it's, you know, you just might have to make some choices. Yes? Do the bears sleep in uncomfortable positions during the winter? No, they actually sleep in very comfortable positions. The male bears will go into a deep sleep, and the females with cubs will be awake, taking care of their cubs and cleaning up after them and nursing them and sleeping when the cubs sleep. And so the females will be moving around and burning a lot more calories during the wintertime than the males. Do the bears leave the den frequently, or do they stay in the den all winter? Well, it depends on the winter. We had one mild winter with a big acorn crop, and the big male bears, I had reports of them up all winter long. If there's no food, the bears will den very early. They may all den in October and not be any bears moving around. The females, the bred females will go to den first. The females with cubs, yearling cubs, will go second. And the males will go last, generally. The male's strategy is to get as big as he can so he can be a breeding male, and you do that by eating as much as you can. And the males are able to also grow during their period of sleep. So, yes? The question is, how long does it take a hibernating bear to wake up if it gets stabbed by a ski pole or something? The reality is they can inflate everything and be on the move in a matter of seconds. They can go very quickly, but bears, if they have a means of escape, we work with bears in the wintertime all the time. If they have an easy escape route, they're not a problem at all. In fact, they're an amazingly docile animal under the circumstances. Yes?
Is there a story behind the name Squirty?
Is there a story behind the name Squirty? Well, names are difficult. And Squirty came to us where there were 3 cubs, and one was a male, and that was easy, that was the boy. And there were 2 females, and they looked almost identical. One was a little smaller than the other, and the other had curly hair on her forehead. So the smaller one was Squirt, and the one with curly hair was Curls. This year we have 5 rehab cubs. Currently we have a graduate student from the University of New Hampshire who's doing research. He's put GPS collars on all the cubs we released last year, as well as the cubs we're going to release next year. And what's interesting is we're getting cubs from nuisance situations. These mothers have been shot by homeowners. They've been run over by cars in residential areas. These bears are coming from what typically has been considered by managers as animals not worth rehabilitating. And what we're finding is that they're not going back to those situations. They have no access to them. These are all being released at one place up in the White Mountains, and they've radiated out of their release site, and they've stayed in the logging areas that are around that big block of woods. And over the years, we've had very few incidents of bears going back to the situation they came out of. The question was, are many of the bears that we've worked with or tagged killed by hunters? Yes. They go back into the general population and they get killed at about the same rate as the general population.